Up until now, I don't think anyone has mentioned this yet, but over the last few months on PS2 alerts, people have been voting on exactly what their favourite continents are. Now, to me personally, these results were extremely surprising. Basically, during almost all of the primetime alerts, there's a choice between, say, going to Indar or going to Oshur, or going to Amerish or Hossin. And each time people make that choice, they're voting on which continent they prefer. Now, since August, when PS2 alerts was fixed, we've got a pretty decent sample size of 9 weeks to look over, and that includes all the different servers. Now, keep in mind, we can't look at off-peak times to determine the popularity of continents, because people aren't getting to pick if they go to Oshur or if they go to Amerish or whatever in those off-peak times. So on Indar, what we can see is that there's 141 alerts found. That's probably because the infantry bases aren't awful relative to Esamir and relative to Oshur. Likewise, the vehicle gameplay is really good, and it's something that construction players also can enjoy. When you look at Indar from a base design perspective, there aren't that many bases in which you can say it's an awful base, at least on the ones that people regularly play on. Maybe there's some near the warp gates which are questionable, but most of the time they don't make sense to capture because of the way lattices are connected. Now we're going to get into the hilarious Oshur primetime alert count in a minute, but first let's go over Amerish, because this is the second most populated continent. I don't think this would have been the case a year ago, and it definitely still surprises me now that this is more popular than Esamir. Esamir almost has 10% less continents played at primetime relative to Amerish. This to me is actually pretty surprising, because basically people don't like to play on Esamir as much these days because the infantry fights are nowhere near as good as they used to be before the Shattered Warp Gate changed to Esamir, but Esamir is still good for vehicles. Whereas on Amerish is good for infantry players, nobody really could contest that, but it's bad for vehicle players in certain scenarios. Essentially, people, if they're playing in vehicles, oftentimes just fight over the ascent area, and there's like a northern road on Amerish which you can kind of have a good vehicle fight at, and that's really it for vehicle fights on Amerish. So I think there's a slight preference towards infantry right now, and that is why we see more people pick Amerish over Esamir. Otherwise I would expect it to be the other way around. Now I want everyone to think in their heads, how many alerts do you think Hossin has at prime time, and how many does Oshur have? And which is most popular? Based on how unpopular Hossin has historically been, I think people would expect Hossin to be dead last, simply because historically people haven't enjoyed going on it that much. However, based on this data, it doesn't seem to be that way as much anymore. People are picking to play on Hossin, and I think to a lot of us, we've really been enjoying playing on Hossin. Hossin is something I look forward to. When I see a Hossin alert, I'm just happy. When I see an Amerish alert again, I'm happy that I'm playing Planetside. There's such great continents to play on, and I'm really liking that, again, Amerish is seeing more popularity, and likewise, even Hossin is starting to see a lot more people play on it. However, now we get to the black swan of Planetside 2's continents, and that is Oshur. With 31 primetime alerts found within the last 9 weeks. And again, compare that to Indar with 140, we really can see a stark comparison there in the popularity of continents. The player base in general is not picking to play on Oshur. I want to go into all the design elements of Oshur which contribute to all that, but first I do want to say on off-peak times as well, if it is just Oshur, man, when people are forced to log into that Oshur map after another continent ends, people are in Yell chat constantly complaining and saying, oh, time to log off, time to play something else, time to go do something else, thanks, now I can go do some work. Like, it's hilarious. People just, every single time Oshur opens and people are forced to play in it, you know, there are a lot of people that just dislike the content. Now, I do want to quickly say this with one short, small addendum, and that is that boat gameplay can be fun on Oshur, and I'm not trying to imply otherwise, but that's if you can find other boats to fight, which is oftentimes a struggle in Oshur because there just aren't that many people other than like a big platoon which are driving around in boats a lot of the time. And again, before we get into roasting Oshur and also talking about all the other continents, I do first want to say that Rel, the mad lad, does have map designers for Planetside 2 which are busy changing the maps around behind the scenes and getting ready for another update. And I just want to make it very clear, these are the mad lads which in the past made Oshur, and we're going to get into all that in a second, and also did the edits for Esamir. Most likely it was the same people, but again, we don't know because we don't know the employees, but more than likely it was the same people. And now these mad lads are going to probably change around Esamir again, or, and that would just be a massive meme, or they're going to change Indar, the beloved continent. And if they mess up Indar, man, people are not going to be happy. But people took it with Esamir, and I won't be surprised if they take it with Indar as well. And I know that's the bad faith attitude perhaps, but again we have to look at the history of the new Esamir which we have, and also Oshur, to really have context for why I and other people may be slightly concerned with how they're going to update the next map that they're going to do. They have people designing the balance for the game, they also have programmers, but likewise they have map designers specifically working on map design all the time behind the scenes, and that scares me. And again, I'm not trying to be a dick, so the rest of this video it is going to be very compassionate. Like, I'm sure the people behind the dev team are nice people. I'm not trying to say that they should be fired. I'm just saying that the training behind whoever's designing the maps needs to be improved. They need to look at maps of popular games, like even just Call of Duty, just things like that they need to look at, and look at map flow and how infantry are flowing through a base, and see how bad it is on, to be honest, a lot of the Planetside maps, but specifically on Oshur it's even worse. Now look, you might be thinking, Zealous, it can't be that bad, surely. And so let's begin with a little bit of a roast for Oshur. Right, so the first part of Oshur that we have to accept is that on half of the bases, there's no infantry point to fight over. It's just an empty, barren land without anything there to go and fight at. And so because of that, people are more disproportionately kind of funneled into the other fights, because half of them they can't go to because there's no actual base there. You're just sitting there in a vehicle waiting to go to the next point. Half of the Oshur bases are essentially pit stops where you're just sitting around waiting. Now to be fair, that wouldn't be as bad if the other half of the bases on Oshur weren't total rubbish. For example, the design of the dam base in the middle of the map looks cool. Visually, the dam base looks cool. It's got a really good concept. A tunnel on one side, the other side's got a hill, there's this cool base that you can point hold in the middle of a badass, really cool to see. But then when we actually look on the dam and look at the bit point that we have to point hold, it's essentially got like 1,000 entrances to it. Again, from a map design perspective, as good as the map may look and as cool as the tunnel may be, and the unique things about the dam, like of course it damming water, it from a design perspective looks good, but from a map design perspective, the actual map flow, the infantry flow, it's not good. Even the shipment containers, for example, it was like a unique design choice. But yeah, it's a super hard base to attack, and you can just backcap it oftentimes. On Oshur as well, one of the very common bases that you see are tridents. In these bases, essentially all you're doing is you're sitting there looking at shields, waiting for people to leave the shields and try to push forward. And that's all that base is. It's not at all enjoyable, and I don't know what the devs were really thinking when they designed this base, that it just isn't good. Likewise, we have the interlinks, which again, it's just looking at shields a lot of the time. And again, visually it might look cool. I understand that visually it looks cool. Likewise, the tridents look cool. And like I like the idea of them, they sound like a fun, novel, creative idea, but from an actual infantry enjoyment perspective, it's not really that unique. And on this base specifically as well, you have to run through open fields, and so you get air to grounded, heshed, run over, whatever, in order to get to the point. And the next thing we have to talk about when we talk about Oshur very quickly, because I do want to quickly talk about the other continents, is on Oshur there's a lot of water. Water is an interesting mechanic in Planetside 2, because if you try to drive over it, you're exposed, and there's no terrain elevation, which is what vehicle players really enjoy. You don't want to just be going over a flat surface, that's dumb. But that's exactly what an ocean essentially is. And so people that are travelling above the water for that reason, it's not necessarily the most compelling gameplay. It's why boats necessarily, whilst they might be fun, don't make the most sense from that perspective either, from a pure gameplay perspective. And if you're going under the water, that's just boring and slow and dull. You can't even shoot underwater, what's the point? So ironically in Oshur, the vehicle players have a deterrent of playing on Oshur, it's just not fun or compelling. Alright, now let's take a step back and then talk about why specifically Indar is so liked relative to the other continent. Indar is a weird continent where it's both good for vehicle players and infantry players at the same time. Now look, would infantry players rather play an Amerish or definitely Hossin? Obviously yes, but for infantry players it's like a 7 out of 10 or a 6 out of 10. It's not like when you go on Oshur or when you even go on Esamir, a lot of the time the infantry fights, they just aren't very good. And so for that reason you have both good vehicle fights and good infantry fights, and I think that's what makes Indar so good. It's because it manages to do both so well. And so my short answer as to what makes a good map really is something that's good for vehicle players and infantry players. Notice I haven't talked about construction much here, because the thing is about construction is it is a niche thing by design, for multiple reasons. Construction players are only 1% of the community. And I love construction players. I used to play routers every single time for like a year and a half straight when I first came back to this game, like 3.5 years ago. I used to love playing construction. Construction was my favourite thing. But you also shouldn't design an entire continent around the idea of construction, again, because it is such a small subset of the community. And I think that that was actually a mindset of Rel when he designed the overall arching idea of Oshur, to think, alright, for Oshur, again, we're going to have construction being a big focus, and like you have to push past construction bases in order to capture the sides of Oshur, and that's going to keep the fights compelling. Whereas now what we're seeing really is there aren't that many construction bases on Oshur a lot of the time, to be honest, and when they do get killed, it's by a few vehicles without much contention from the opposition. Unless of course it's on a bridge, and arguably that construction player on that bridge is oftentimes levying their position in order to farm kills with a flail, and they're not so much interested in how fun the bridge fight necessarily is. The really concerning thing to me, and this isn't meant to be toxic towards the devs, it's just that when you look at the way that they construct the maps on Planetside 2, oftentimes they understand, look, it should be good for both infantry and vehicles, but then we get something like the new Esamir, which isn't good for infantry, and we get something like the new Oshur, which isn't good for either. They don't really seem to understand the magic behind what makes Indar so great and why it's good for everyone, even though nobody's super happy with it. You know, no infantry players going on Indar and thinking, oh my god, can't wait to play. But at the same time, it's not like this awful thing like when you go into, to be honest, Oshur. To be honest, at this point, I think the devs, if they actually were focused solely on the performance of the game and they didn't care about what was on their resume or anything, you know, they wouldn't be designing things like Outfit Wars, which you play for 30 minutes once a week for, you know, once every 6 months. That's not a good investment of time. And with the reception of Oshur, to be honest, they would probably look at the content and think, look, the player base doesn't enjoy it. It isn't something the player base is enjoying. We may as well just take it out of rotation or make it something that happens, you know, once a week as a special event on a Sunday. And I know that would be hard to program, I'm just saying it as an example. What they definitely shouldn't be doing is adding water to Indar. You know, if they want to mess up Esamir even more, go ahead. I'm not particularly fussed as an infantry player, but man, if they touch Indar and make that bad, and now it's just Amerish that I want to play and just Hossin, I am not going to be happy. Again, they've taken out the spawn system, they've released a bad continent, and they again changed a beloved continent, the old Esamir, before the Shattered Warp Gate, and made it bad and then made it even worse. Again, I'm not super impressed with the devs. Even more so, and again, as people ensure the great people, I'm not trying to say that they're bad people, and so I'm just saying professionally here, the balance changes they've done for infantry have been concerningly uninformed. The idea of removing Nano Weave was essentially that it wasn't about lowering the time to kill for me, it was about lowering the headshot multiplier, which is associated with a high skill ceiling. Lowering the time to kill by removing Nano Weave at the same time actually probably has a net neutral effect in terms of skill ceiling. But not only did they not understand that and maybe just make Nano Weave something that behind the scenes is just on everyone all the time and also applies to heads, they not only flat out removed it, but they, before doing that, tried to lower the movement speed of it, which was just painfully annoying to run around with. People would still do it, I would still do it because it's meta, but like, it's annoying. You know, that isn't a good game design choice. And then after that, they took it out, and I don't think they really understood what was going to happen with shotguns, and nor do they seem to particularly care. I have to run heavy assault now. I was starting to run a lot more medic, but I have to run heavy assault now because otherwise I just get one shot killed by shotguns. It's frustratingly annoying. And likewise, because you don't have Nano Weave anymore, everyone has a less effective HP, but the overshield amount that people have on heavy assault is the same. And so essentially it's actually a small buff to heavy assault by removing Nano Weave, ironically. Probably like a good half of my engagements, very scarily, are against casual players which are running around as engineer, light assault, medic, and I'm killing them, and maybe I have 400 HP left, or 300 HP, or 200 HP. In each of those scenarios, if I wasn't playing heavy assault, or they were, I would be dead. But I'm basically starving off just the fact that I'm playing heavy assault and they're not. And again, that just to me, again, it just seems unbalanced. Like, what? It just seems dumb. But I don't think the devs are particularly interested in it. I don't think they care that the air hammer for some reason doesn't apply to flak, but then the Banshee and the PPA does. And likewise, I don't think they care particularly about the other faction imbalances. I don't think they care about that stuff at all. And I kind of understand why, because when you look at the brass tacks of it, you can make the argument that it's only something that veteran players that are already bought into the game care about, and by virtue of the fact that they're bought into the game, you don't have to worry about them as much, and you should instead focus on things that are going to bring in more people and make more people bought into the game. Maybe you should focus on that. I understand why, particularly they may not care about balance, but it's still frustrating as hell. And you know, that whole line of logic is a separate video entirely, but anyway, I'll leave that for some other time, probably at some point, I'm sure. Anyway, hope everyone has a wonderful week. Until next time, I'm out. GG. Bye bye.